So what we tried to do here is provide a somewhat different perspective on the geopolitics and the geoeconomics from specialists who are, in some respects practitioners or have been practitioners of diplomacy and of military history. So by way of a quick introduction, the first speaker on the panel will be Louise Tumchewics. She's an assistant professor of military history and has written 2 books, one which is already available about siege warfare, and the second one which is still under construction, and I guess coming out shortly about urban warfare. Or I think I've got the order reversed. The first one is about urban warfare, and the one that's coming out is about siege warfare. So very relevant to what's going on the ground in Ukraine today. So she's going to give us a kind of update on where things stand and where she thinks things will go on the battlefield and between Russia and Ukraine. Then Sir Adam Thomson will be the next speaker. He was UK ambassador to NATO and the United Nations, and also has been an envoy of the United Kingdom in New Delhi, in Pakistan, and in Washington as well. And then Evans Revere will speak about a US perspective on the bigger global picture, particularly China and East Asia. He was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. And then the final speaker will be Pramit Pal Chaudhuri. Pramit is with the Aspen Institute in India, but he was a national security advisor to the government of India, an independent member of the National Security Advisory Council in the previous government and also in the beginning of the current Modi government, right? So, kind of a very different set of speakers than Marco, and a very different set of speakers from each other to kind of give a global perspective about what's going on. So I think each of the speakers is going to start with kind of a 5 to 7 minute overview. That's how we'll spend the first half hour. Then we'll go back and forth with the panel and with yourselves and hopefully make this very interactive. And so I'm hoping my job is going to be very easy and everybody else's job is going to be very difficult. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Louise, who's going to tell us about the war.
Thank you very much, Arnab, and thank you very much to FLAR for extending the invitation, and also to INVESCO for inviting me here as well. It's a real pleasure to be here. The microphone didn't think so. But what I'll do this morning is just give an overview of what's happening on the front lines in Ukraine, the ongoing Russian mobilization, bombardment of Ukrainian cities, and then turn to some cheerful chat about dirty bombs and nuclear weapons. So I've chosen this map because I think the projection puts the Russia-Ukraine conflict in its wider global context, and particularly in regards to Europe, to India, and to China, which the following speakers will be discussing in more detail. So here we have a map of the war. This is accurate to about 48 hours ago. So I'm just going to work my way sort of down the front line from the east all the way to the south. And what we see happening in the war at the moment. In the east, there has been Ukrainian efforts to push back on Russian-occupied territory and reclaim some of this ground that was lost over the summer. There have been some reports, of course, of fighting being stalled due to muddy conditions and unfavorable weather. And this will be a continuing theme over the next few months, particularly as both Russian and Ukrainian forces have to contend with general winter. A noted foe on the battlefields of Eastern Europe. In Donetsk, this is where Russian forces have gained some ground recently. Their objective here is to control the entire region, which is the claimed territory of Russia's proxies in the Donbass. This is where fighting began in 2014. Russia's made some gains northwest of Donetsk, and has really been concentrating its efforts around here on Bakhmut. The city of Bakhmut is a city of about 70,000 people. It's been subject to nearly constant aerial bombardment because it sits at a strategic location on the highway leading to the Ukrainian-held cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. So an important position there, and to reclaim it would be both a strategic boon to Russia, but also a symbolic one as well, being seen to help out their proxies and to regain control of this region. Moving down into the southern axis, I think most attention is concentrated here on Kherson and on this southeastern area, where you can see that Ukrainian forces have made gains recently. Russian forces are continuing to conduct air, missile, and artillery strikes on this area and on these cities, Mykolaiv and Zaporizhzhia. Russia's objective here is to maintain as much of this front line as they can and try to secure their rear areas against Ukrainian airstrikes. There are indications that Russia is preparing for defensive action for Kherson City, building up defenses on the eastern side of the Dnipro River, which you can't see too clearly here. But what that tells us is that Russia doesn't believe that it can hold Kherson City. It's preparing that it might actually lose this position. Now, why is that significant? Well, Kherson was the one regional city that was occupied here, or quite early on in the war, and it is significant for the supply of water to Crimea, to Russian-held Crimea. What we've seen in the past few weeks is a lot of people and material moving from the western side of the river to the eastern side of the river. And that suggests that Russia knows it's not going to hold it, but so it's moving its resources so that it can put up quite a stiff fight. When Russia fights for Kherson, it is not going to be a nice, neat withdrawal. If anything, what we've seen, certainly from recent experience in fighting for Ukrainian cities, with the near total destruction of cities like Chernihiv in the north, and the bombardment of Kharkiv, and certainly the almost total destruction of Mariupol, is that fighting for Kherson will be very destructive. Even if Russia doesn't hold it, it will intend to do as much damage as it can on the way out. What the Ukrainian siege, recapture of these territories presents, the challenge it presents to Putin politically, is that he has already preemptively annexed these territories. Now, he annexed them before having total military control of these territories. So what does he do then if he has territories that have been annexed to Russia but fall back into Ukrainian control? That will be a difficult one for him. What has been in the news quite recently is Russia's mobilization and force generation efforts. What Russia's seeking to do here is expand their combat power without conducting general mobilization. They need more troops, but how to do that short of declaring a war. We've seen how unpopular Russia's limited mobilization has been, with thousands of men attempting to flee the country to avoid mobilization. And what's happening is that a lot of workers are fleeing Russia. It's placing quite a bit of stress on the Russian labor market, particularly with things like information technology, and even the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Digital Development, the central bank, members of their workforce who would be eligible for mobilization are actively trying to flee, so leading to some very important gaps. As well, even public services like transportation are coming under pressure because of a labor shortage, which means that things like the buses aren't running on time. And these kinds of frictions will just increase the fissures between the Russian population, the government, local leadership. We've seen that the Kremlin is trying to reframe the narrative of the war into something that will appeal to ethnic Russians, but also the sizable number of Muslim minorities within Russia, as one of Marco's graphics so vividly demonstrated. This is not a diversity and inclusion drive by the Russian armed forces by any stretch. It is really a manpower drive and an attempt to make sure that there isn't sort of tension and friction within their own forces. There have been some reports of that already, because that constitutes another manpower risk. The Russian military is also trying to leverage foreigners to bolster its numbers. So there have been reports that some members of Russia's Wagner Group have been contacting former members of the Afghan National Army to see if they might come and join the fight. And there's also some evidence that Belarusian drivers and mechanics have been employed to repair and maintain Russian military vehicles in Belarus. Now, it's very likely that more of these activities will continue as Russia tries to find ways to augment its forces. Russian morale continues to be very low, and units are severely under strength. So we see units that are fighting at only 19% strength, maybe 23% strength, and poor logistics, a lack of training, a lack of food, tough conditions. Winter is approaching. It's cold, rainy, and muddy out there. And that's all contributing to low morale. Over the past week, Russian forces have continued to conduct air, missile, and drone strikes against targets in Ukraine. These are primarily civilian targets and civilian infrastructure. What we can see, however, is that the tempo of these strikes is starting to slow down. What this possibly reflects is that there's the decreasing missile and drone stockpiles, as well as the limited effectiveness of these strikes at achieving Russian strategic goals. So a lot of these strikes have been targeting civilian infrastructure, so electricity, power plants, other pieces of civilian infrastructure, homes, and what that does is really, it's an attempt to impose civilian casualties, sow fear, create deprivation, hopefully start to crumble some Ukrainian resistance. Of course, the deliberate bombing of civilian infrastructure contravenes the laws of armed conflict, but this is very much in keeping with Russian precedent activity in Chechnya and in Syria. We saw the widespread destruction of civilian areas in cities. What we have seen in recent airstrikes is the use of Iranian Shahed 136 drones. This may be possibly to compensate for the depletion of Russian cruise missile stockpiles. But this isn't a perfect solution. Iran can only ship about 300 of these drones at a time, and drones are expensive and time-consuming to manufacture. And at this point, it's really impossible to tell how much sort of Iranian domestic discontent might affect Iran's ability to continue to manufacture and ship weapons to Russia. We don't really know at this time, but were things to escalate significantly in Iran, it's quite likely that they might be curtailing or reducing their foreign commitments. There's another benefit to this for Iran, is that the Ukraine conflict provides them with an opportunity to test both their technology and their tactics. Ukraine offers Iran a bit of a battle lab for how are their drones going to perform in conflict and what adjustments might they want to make. We've seen this before in other regional conflicts, certainly in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria. These sorts of regional conflicts are an opportunity for other powers to test their technologies, to test their tactics. And certainly that will continue in Ukraine. Now, over the past week, the Kremlin was intensifying an information operation about a possible dirty bomb that the Ukrainians were going to use in some sort of false flag attack, possibly on Ukrainian infrastructure. There were reports that the Russian chief of the general staff called his counterparts. I'm really sort of making a case for Russia's possible use of a dirty bomb, and a dirty bomb being a conventional explosive that is laced with a radioactive material. This could be radioactive material that you might get from, say, a hospital. It's not a nuclear weapon. It doesn't, it certainly wouldn't be of that sophistication. A dirty bomb has never actually been used, but there have been multiple threats. What does this tell us? Well, what it says is that Russia's really testing the information environment with these kinds of rumors. They're sort of building a case. Let's see how well this lands. I can't say that there's imminent danger of Russia conducting this sort of false flag event, but what it indicates to us, because the West hasn't bought into this idea, and in fact, Western intelligence had flagged that this kind of thing might happen sort of a week before it did, means that Russia's probably testing the information environment. How much is this going to be? How much credibility can this gain before trying to follow through with that?
Louise,
now,
if I can just ask, do you think they will follow through because of how badly everything else is going?
I think there's a possibility that there could be a false flag event, something that perhaps would target, a key piece of infrastructure, like a hydroelectric dam, for example. What that would do would be to sort of create time and space for Russia to sort of regroup, resupply, gain an advantage. We'll see if they feel the need to do that over the next 4 to 6 weeks. We've got this window, as Marco mentioned in the previous presentation. We've got this rather short window of time before winter really sets in, and winter in eastern Ukraine is not particularly pleasant. It's not optimal fighting conditions. So we may see an escalation of activity really condensed into the next 4 weeks. But if that doesn't happen, we'll probably see not a cessation of hostilities by any means, but probably a slowdown in tempo, and the winter being used as an opportunity. There will be some skirmishes, of course. There probably will be continued airstrikes, but both sides using it as an opportunity to sort of consolidate what positions they have, resupply, and prepare for a renewed offensive when the weather conditions are a bit more favorable. What we did see this week was Vladimir Putin sat at another massive table in the Kremlin. It was a round one this time, observing a live stream of nuclear weapons tests in Siberia. They were launched from the nuclear weapons, cruise missiles were launched from the Arctic to Russia's Far East. Now, the US was told about the drill under the terms of the New START arms treaty, and in notifying the US of what they were going to do, the Russians were complying with their arms control obligations. The last time they had one of these drills was about 5 days before their invasion of Ukraine. And the defense minister was seen on Russian TV explaining that the aim of this drill was really, it was practicing their response in the event of a need to retaliate for an enemy's nuclear strike. What this really does against the backdrop of a flagging ground campaign is to remind both the West and also the Russian domestic population of Russia's nuclear capabilities. Before I hand over to our following panelists, I would say that what we see from Putin's rhetoric is that he's not particularly interested in negotiating with Ukraine. He's really maintaining quite maximalist objectives for this campaign. He still wants a military victory, and he would probably prefer regime change in Kyiv that favored Russia, and favored a permanent reorientation of Ukraine towards Russia rather than towards the West. However, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, the widespread suffering, the documentation of war crimes, which will doubtless increase as Russian forces retreat from places like Kherson, means that Kyiv is also more likely to push for a more maximalist objective in the war as well, and it wouldn't be politically palatable for Zelensky to settle for a negotiated settlement. Mm-hmm. However, what's going to be really important for both sides is that long logistics tail to keep both of them supplied. Russian logistics have demonstrated some key weaknesses since the beginning of the campaign. Certainly their manufacturing sector will be under pressure to keep up with the supply of material that they need to continue their campaign. Likewise, Ukraine will be dependent on continued supply and support from the United States and Europe, and will really be quite reliant on the continued unity of that coalition to maintain its supply of material as well.
Okay. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Louise. It's fair to say that we've all become armchair epidemiologists and now armchair generals as well as armchair economists, right? Well, so with that, maybe we can turn to Sir Adam Thomson to give his perspective on where Adam, you see this going from the side of Western Europe and the Western coalition, vis-a-vis the battle, the war in Ukraine.
Thanks, Arnab, and thank you for this opportunity. Much appreciated. I'm happy to offer a Western perspective. Consequences are going to be vast economic costs for Europe, for the Euro-Atlantic area, for the world. There will be massive reconstruction costs. So I am increasingly predicting Western expropriation of Russian assets. 350 billion is the current World Bank estimate of reconstruction in Ukraine. This is going to be a Cold War not the 20th century Cold War, but it's not lazy analysis to talk about a Cold War. It's a prediction. There are, of course, variables about how deep, how wide, how fast, how dangerous, and how much of the rest of the world gets sucked in. But the dynamic is unmistakable, and it will get a lot uglier than it is already. Some of the ugliness is likely to affect markets, other bits perhaps not. Quite a lot of damage has already been priced in. You asked me, Arnab, to say a bit about Western and European responses to the hostilities and the possibility of escalation. I think there will be further escalation on change Russia's nuclear posture so that it looks like he's preparing for nuclear action. Even if he doesn't intend it, the crisis will be a very real one. The West, for its part, will escalate with more military equipment, more ammunition, more sanctions. If the war is protracted, I suspect the West will increasingly consider selected secondary sanctions and covert disruption inside Russia. In Europe, the EU is having a remarkably good war. It's transformed its European peace facility, recently created, into something that has supplied several billions euros of military equipment to Ukraine. It's just decided on an EU training mission for the Ukrainian army. The UK is part of this, demonstrating the slogan that it may be leaving the EU, but it's not leaving Europe. And the EU is edging towards some radical shifts in its energy policy. NATO too, very regenerated by all of this. This is really NATO bread and butter, and in the process, it's acquired or is about to acquire Swedish and Finnish membership, and it has seen Russia weakened all around Russia's periphery, not just on its border with Finland, but also in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, and even weakening to Chinese influence in eastern Siberia. What are the prospects for Western unity? It's really critical to President Putin's political survival now that he should be able to split the West, that he should be able to, in the Russian formula, make them see reason, and he's going to continue to find ways to try to drive wedges and stress things. However, I agree with Marco that the greatest threat to Western cohesion is the United States and the US presidential election, rather than any other fracturing, because President Putin is likely to ensure Western cohesion through Russian behavior in Ukraine. The Russian state has always been remarkably oblivious to its effect on others. Finally, how are Western, particularly European security arrangements going to evolve and change over time as a result of the war? Well, the war is transformational, but it may not change institutions a great deal. The West-Russia relationship is ruptured for decades to come, I believe. the precise consequences for European security arrangements are going to depend on the course of the war and other developments. And at the moment, I think it's fair to say that the West really has no plan, no agreed benchmarks, no agreement on handling Russia, and no real ambition to split Moscow and Beijing. So the medium and long term is very much up for grabs. But in terms of architecture, I'd prefer to think of weather change or ecosystems rather than something as solid as architecture. It's possible there could be a deal that stops the fighting. Most likely not. Most likely is NATO and Western containment of Russia, either on its own borders or somewhere inside Ukraine. You can expect to see accelerated institutional development of NATO militarily, and more especially of the European Union, which will return to consider seriously, but in a transatlantic friendly way, the whole question of strategic autonomy. The war is also quite likely to drive more rapid than otherwise enlargement to Ukraine and the Balkans by the European Union. I think it's an outlier scenario, but one still worth thinking about is some fracturing of the Russian Federation as a result of the failure of this war. I don't think that's likely, but we might well see more internal Russian instability, mainly ethnic driven. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Thank you very much for that sobering and say realistic assessment. Evans, why don't we turn to you to give us your perspective on the wider picture in the world as a whole, particularly as it relates to East Asia and the elephant in the room of the U.S.-China relationship.
Thank you very much, Arnab. It's a real privilege to participate in this panel. Thanks to Flor for doing this and for making me a part of it. And it's also a pleasure to offer some thoughts to this distinguished audience from a diplomatic practitioner's perspective. Today, of course, we're witnessing what many have called the most consequential military, diplomatic, and geopolitical assault on the post-World War II order since the end of the Cold War, indeed, since the end of World War II. Post-World War II norms and understandings, however flawed they may have been, norms and understandings concerning the sanctity of borders, the peaceful resolution of territorial and political disputes, and the use of nuclear weapons, all of these things have been swept aside as Vladimir Putin has sought to establish his version of Greater Russia by erasing Ukraine from the map. Perhaps the greatest of the post-World War II institutions, the United Nations Security Council, has been powerless to prevent this, thanks to the what I call the pseudo-alliance between Russia and China that has rendered the Council fundamentally impotent. At the same time, the Moscow-Beijing partnership has also blocked Security Council action on the threat posed by a nuclear-armed and quite belligerent North Korea. An innocent observer might be forgiven for concluding that because of the Moscow-Beijing axis, the institution of the United Nations Security Council itself might very well be in the process of dying. Meanwhile, today, a key question for all of us is what lessons Russia's Chinese partner is learning from Putin's failed attempt to realize his vision of conquering Ukraine. Beijing, of course, has its own vision to play a much greater and even dominant role in Asia and beyond, taking advantage of its economic success, the rapid growth of the PLA's military capability, and China's belief that the United States and its fellow democracies may lack the will or the ability to hinder the PRC's realization of its China dream. And I don't need to remind you that a core component of that dream is making Taiwan part of the PRC. But China's PLA, which of course is tasked with seizing Taiwan by force if ordered to, surely cannot have been emboldened by the incompetence and ineffectiveness of Russia's military machine against what was, at least on paper, an inferior adversary. This has given some hope that a rational Chinese leadership would not resort to force of arms against Taiwan for fear the island might put up a fight reminiscent of Ukraine's. But there is another school of thought that argues the opposite, that Russia's problems in Ukraine mean that China might accelerate its military assault plans before Taiwan, with support from the United States and others, improves its defenses to the point where a PLA assault on the island might just fail. If that latter school of thought is correct, we should brace ourselves for a difficult next 3 or 4 years as Taiwan's self-strengthening process races against the clock of China's ambitions. All of this, of course, is taking place in the context of a troubling deterioration in US-China relations and, of course, growing strategic rivalry between the two superpowers. In that context, Beijing no doubt hopes that Russia's Ukraine war, however flawed and chaotic it is going to divert US attention away from the Asia-Pacific region. Beijing has, of course, hinted about its misgivings regarding Russia's military adventure in the Ukraine, but the PRC's bottom line remains that anything that complicates Washington's security calculus is, by definition, good for China. Hence, Beijing's willingness to tolerate the actions of an aggressive, nuclear-armed North Korea, and, together with Russia, to provide Pyongyang with diplomatic cover in the UN Security Council. Meanwhile, the United States is definitely not standing idly by in Asia, just as Russia's invasion breathed new life into what one European member once called a brain-dead NATO. The rest of Asia is organizing itself to contend with China for the long haul. Russia's aggression in Ukraine, Russia's pseudo-alliance with China, China's assertiveness in Asia, Beijing's support for North Korea, Beijing's military and rhetorical muscle flexing against Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, the PRC's island building and fortification of those islands in the South China Sea, and China's potential threat against vital sea lanes in the region. All of these things have breathed new life into political, diplomatic, and military cooperation between and among the United States and like-minded democracies in the Indo-Pacific region. One would think that under normal circumstances, all of this might give Beijing pause and prompt Beijing to follow a cautious path going forward. But that is not necessarily a given. At his triumphal Party Congress, Xi Jinping packed the Politburo Standing Committee with loyalists, with acolytes and sycophants. Impediments to Xi's more aggressive approach to regional and global diplomacy have been removed from the scene, physically, as we saw, with the departure of one former senior Chinese official from the other day. Key military figures, including those responsible for China's ongoing confrontation with India and its hard line towards Taiwan, have been kept on or have been elevated in the aftermath of the Party Congress. And with this lineup, who will dare tell Xi Jinping he is wrong, or who will dare oppose an ill-advised diplomatic or military move by China's re-elected leader? A re-anointed Xi Jinping could expand his assertive approach to relations with neighbors and the United States. Accordingly, the already difficult relations between Beijing and Washington seem deemed to continue. And Beijing will continue to look the other way as North Korea enhances its nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities. As long as North Korea's actions do not directly undermine China's own security, Beijing seems content with supporting its adventurous neighbor and treaty ally. And as with its posture towards Russia, the PRC, I think, sees benefits from North Korean actions that complicate US, South Korean, and Japanese security calculations. In this connection, when, as is likely, North Korea conducts its expected 7th nuclear test, China's reaction will tell us a lot about what we should expect from the PRC going forward. Meanwhile, by now, even Xi Jinping must know he made the wrong bet by deciding on supporting a no-limits, as he called it, partnership with Moscow. But having made this bed, Xi must lie in it, since it serves his strategic interests in countering the United States. But even an emboldened Xi Jinping seems unlikely to risk sanctions and international opprobrium by providing Russia with the military, logistical, and economic support that it obviously needs. At the same time, the United States and NATO's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the strong multilateral measures adopted against Russia have sent a strong signal to Beijing that military adventurism against Taiwan would come at a terrible price for China. But will this restrain China from moving against Taiwan? Perhaps. But don't forget that Taiwan remains a deeply emotional issue for the PRC. Beijing has defined unification with Taiwan as a core component of its plan to rejuvenate the Chinese nation and achieve the China dream. Beijing is not likely to sit idly by if it sees Taiwan moving permanently out of its grasp, or if it decides that outside forces are blocking its hopes for national unification. Today, the conflict in Ukraine rightly seizes our attention, but let's not forget that tomorrow, untoward developments in Asia could create a conflict that would dwarf what we are currently seeing in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Evan. Very, very troubling as well. Okay, well, maybe we turn now to Pramit to hear your perspective on India's perspective on the conflict in Europe and the prospects in Asia.
Thank you, Arnab. The defining strategic concern for India for the past roughly 10 years has been China, and it is now overwhelmingly so. Most remarkably was a military clash between the two countries on the Sino-Indian border in 2020 that left 20 Indian soldiers and an unspecified number of Chinese dead. This was the first lethal clash between the two countries since the 1980s. But even before that, India, for example, had introduced national security screening for Chinese investment and has been banning Chinese companies like TikTok, for example, in the digital and data sectors of its economy. Last fiscal year, Chinese FDI into India fell by 74%, even while overall global FDI into India actually rose. To be the CEO of a Chinese company in India is to be faced almost non-stop harassment. The president of the CEO of Huawei India was recently dragged before an Indian court over tax evasion and yelled at the judge, "I'm just a CEO, not a terrorist. Stop treating me like one." The judge didn't actually give his opinion as to what he thought. But the result is almost everything India now does strategically is first run through the China prism. And the first element of that has been a much, much closer relationship with the United States. The most evident form of that has been the reactivation of the Quad, a relationship which is strategic but not military between Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. And this revolves largely around critical technologies. But there's also been an acceleration in bilateral relations between the two countries on the military and defense side that we're now seeing developing at a really remarkable pace. So when the Ukraine war broke out, The Indian response was basically, we are still, even right now, there are over 60,000 Chinese troops in forward positions on the Ladakh border between India and China. But because of a number of legacy issues, India still is dependent upon Russian weapons. 50%, it's declining, but 50% of India's arsenal is effectively Russian in origin. But one of the consequences of India buying and working with the Russians has been that Russia has retained a neutral stance whenever India and China have gone head to head. So, for example, 2 years ago when the two armies clashed, the Russian response was, we both of you are our friends, please sit down and talk it out. And in the meantime, we were happy to sell weapons to both sides. So it was worth it for the Indian view that keep Russia on that line. So, but when the Ukraine war broke out, because we had tensions with China still going on the border, the view was, one, we have to maintain the military supply chain to Russia, given our dependence, especially on fighter aircraft and some forms of armor. Second, when India approached the United States, the American response at the highest level was very clear. You're a member of the Quad, you're central to the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States. We're prepared to look the other way regarding what you do with Russia, in part because India doesn't have that much influence on what happens in Ukraine or in Russia. As somebody in the Indian government said, our only source of interest in Ukraine traditionally has been sunflower oil imports. Other than that, we've never had a relationship with them. But one thing I should point out, Modi has reached out repeatedly to Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and he has refrained from criticizing India on its position, arguing privately, I gather, that your relationship with Russia may be of utility to Ukraine later on because I may need you, I believe the term was, as a bridge to the Kremlin at some future point. So continue with where you are. But the one interesting development, I think, as far as India is concerned, is that there is now, India is waiting to watch, and I think we'll see an acceleration of what was already a managed decline in the Indo-Russian relationship. But now it's waiting to see how close Russia and China come together. As I've said, for India, one of the key points of the relationship was to maintain Russian neutrality regarding India versus China. If Russia is unable to maintain that position after this war, then automatically it is impossible for Russia to maintain that relationship with Russia, or the utility of Russia immediately declines. Even when I've gone to Washington and spoken to members of the Biden team, they've been very clear that their bigger concern for them was not so much as what India did regarding Ukraine, but was whether China would consider expanding the war to relieve pressure on Russia, either by turning on India or turning on Taiwan. And for them, because India is dependent militarily on Russia, this was seen as one of the key, a bigger concern for them than anything else. That seems to be declining for the time being, but as I've said, China has not pulled its soldiers back. They are still in forward positions, including armor, fighter aircraft, and missiles. And both countries now have almost 150,000 soldiers aligned on the border in forward positions. In other words, they're now within rifle range of each other in many places, which was not the case before. So for India, it's still really about the Indo-Pacific, and it's still really all about China. The loss of Russia would be seen as, if you wish, an unfortunate addition to China and a loss to India. But fundamentally, India is very clearly drifting closer and closer to the United States and the West, because that's where the China story is going.
Okay, thanks very much. We have about 40 minutes for discussion and Q&A. So the floor is open, so if anyone wants to ask a question, please go ahead. I have plenty of questions myself, so I can start the conversation while people are formulating their questions. Maybe I can start with you, Adam. You mentioned the estimates of the cost of reconstruction of Ukraine from the World Bank of about $350 billion, which fits rather neatly with, it's quite close to the amount of reserves of the Central Bank of Russia that have been frozen by the West but not yet seized. Do you think that's where this is going, that those reserves will be attached and used for that reconstruction?
Frankly, I do. I'm neither a banker or a lawyer. I'm only a diplomat. But although $350 billion isn't all that much in the larger scheme of things, I read that globally, governments have already spent $550 million on energy subsidies as part of the fallout of this crisis already. And of course, the United States managed to spend a couple $1 trillion over 20 years in Afghanistan. Nonetheless, finding as much as $350 billion to reconstruct a country is very difficult indeed, because it's not hard to sustain the political will during the fight. It's much harder to persuade your publics and your legislatures to come up with the money after the fight. I regret to say that the West has a well-established track record of addressing international law in such a way as to find the answer it wants to hear. So there will be misgivings, there will be legal questions, but the longer the war goes on, the more the price tag goes up, the more that the European Union is committed to bringing Ukraine in as a member, the greater the temptation to take those Russian assets to help pay for it.
Okay, so if I can follow up on that idea, right? So this, as you've all in one way or another said, right, this is a major assault on the post-World War II rules-based international order. Part of that order has been, although there have been some violations of it, part of that order has been the sanctity of reserves. But I guess it sounds like what you're saying is that the threat and this assault are so extreme that we cannot allow this to stand, and we will take those reserves for that purpose, because I guess in a way the aggressor should pay. So even if the aggressor does not come to the table, even if there isn't a negotiated solution, there will be a payment made by Russia, enforced by the West, and I suppose the United States in particular. Is that the right way to think about it?
That is the right way to think about it. I mean, I would add my thesis, which is that although this isn't exactly existential for either side, it is utterly fundamental to their current political philosophies. And for the West, although there are compromises to be made over territory if they must, fundamentally, the West, however you define it, needs to assert the principles that territory is not taken by force, borders are not changed by force, and that countries are free to choose their alliances. These are fundamental tenets of the organization I used to work at, NATO. And the momentum of those convictions, I think, will carry through not just the fighting phase, but the aftermath. It is important, even if compromises are made and deals done with Putin, that he should be seen to have failed in his attempt to take territory by force, to wipe another nation off the map. And there will be a very strong political imperative, not just a financial one, to make a success of post-war Ukraine. That can't be done without very large sums of money.
Evans, I see you raised your hand. Did you want to come in?
I completely agree with what Ambassador Thompson just said. I would just add one more thing to the list of concerns on the part of the West, part of NATO, and the United States in particular, and that is among the egregious outrages committed by Russia in starting this war and pursuing this war is also the human rights dimension, the toll that this war has taken on innocent civilians, the indiscriminate bombing directed intentionally at civilians. This is going to be a powerful factor in affecting the American thinking, American government's thinking, if and when it comes to a decision as to whether we should press for the confiscation of those assets.
Okay, well, staying with you for a little while longer, what do you think is the reading in Beijing about this freezing of the reserves and their possible seizure?
As I suggested in my earlier remarks, there is very little that has been done against Russia that does not have ramifications one way or the other for China. I dare say the Chinese are probably paying at least as much attention to the downstream implications of all of this for them in terms of sanctions, isolation, etc., measures to be taken against China in the event that it decides to support Russia more directly, or if it acts against Taiwan. There's more attention being paid to those issues than the actual situation on the ground, the military situation on the ground in the Ukraine. If you're a Chinese national security planner, a defense planner, an economic planner, you need to be thinking very, very hard about the experience that Russia is going through right now, as it is subject to increasingly burdensome international measures, economic, trade, and diplomatic measures, because all of those measures at some point down the road may very well be used against you. And I suspect that is weighing very heavily on the minds of the Chinese right now.
Okay. Just want to check and make sure there are no questions in the audience yet, and also from the virtual audience. Yes, Maria, or from you yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Arnab. One question related with the previous session where Marco described the Ukraine situation as if we are reaching an equilibrium phase, right? And I would like to know your opinion on what do you think would be required to reach that equilibrium, given that neither of the sides of the war could be happy with the current situation, either Russia with part of the annexed territories being occupied by Ukraine, and of course Ukraine is not happy with what's currently happening. But what would be good enough for both sides to reach that equilibrium?
Okay. Maybe we can start with you, Louise, on that. What would be a balance and an equilibrium militarily? And then maybe we can go to the others for politically and geopolitically.
Okay, thank you for your question. Certainly, judging by the rhetoric of both sides, both sides, very, very vociferous in that there isn't an equilibrium, that they don't, that they're not amenable to a negotiated settlement at this point. Militarily, I think an equilibrium might come. Certainly, you'd certainly see a slowdown if both sides struggle to maintain their supply lines and maintain the levels of equipment that they need to continue their offensives and counteroffensives. So, for instance, if there was, certainly for the Russian side, if they are not able to maintain their manufacturing capacity, if they have more problems with their logistics and getting equipment to their front lines, or if they're struggling to purchase equipment from, from other countries, say, and again, their potential sort of potential partners in that are limited because China's not going to sell to them. Iran might sell to them. Iran might get distracted by some things going on in Iraq. might not be willing to sell. There are some supply issues certainly facing Russia. And likewise for Ukraine, if it can't maintain the supplies of things like HIMARS and NLAWs that have been so important to it in the past few months, let's say if there was an outcome in the US election that was unfavorable to continuing the high levels of support for Ukraine, might see that their position is also harder to maintain. However, I do think that the war crimes that have been committed against the Ukrainian people and the very strong resistance that is being put up and would make it sort of very, very difficult for Ukraine to reach an equilibrium that would satisfy the Ukrainian people.
Okay, thank you. Adam, maybe we can turn to you. What do you think from the point of view of both maybe your leadership network, the European Leadership Network, and the Russian membership there? What do you see as Russia might see as an equilibrium, and what might work for Western Europe?
So this is a more political response to complement Louise's military one. The first thing to say is that even if an equilibrium is achieved, I don't think anybody on either side of the divide, the Ukrainians we talk to, our Russian members, think it's likely to be a stable one, and it's certainly not a solution. The Russian objectives are now difficult to change because President Putin is so personally committed to them, and because he has, in classic fashion, doubled down and backed himself deliberately into a corner, so that the annexation of Ukrainian territory is embedded in the Russian constitution. That said, I think my answer really depends not so much on what happens on the battlefield, but what happens in international politics. President Putin's departure would permit some kinds of equilibrium that are impossible while he is in power. A Trump presidency would change the dynamic and what Washington was urging on Kiev in terms of slowing down and settling for a demarcation line. The Russians in our network don't see any change in the Kremlin's objectives at the moment. They don't expect any change in the Kremlin's objectives. They describe even the loss of one annexed territory, let alone all four, let alone Crimea, as a strategic defeat politically for President Putin. So that's another way of saying that he has successfully backed himself into a corner. Similarly, President Zelensky has gone a long way in that direction. In the early stages of the conflict, the Ukrainians could clearly contemplate calling a halt if Russia was driven back to the line of 23rd of February. That, I think, it might now be very hard to get accepted in Ukraine, even if Western powers leaned pretty heavily. Bottom line, I think we're a long way from any equilibrium that's going to last for any amount of time. It's bad news, I'm afraid, but almost everything about this is bad news.
Yeah, I agree. There's no point in sugarcoating it. Evans and Pramit, maybe I can turn to you a little bit on this question as well. It seemed like at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit that President Xi and Prime Minister Modi had somewhat dressed down the president of Russia, and yet he seemed to have doubled down yet again and re-escalated. Do you think there's any potential pressure from the no limits partner in China, or this military alliance and desire to keep Russia on side, somewhat on side, or at least neutral from India? Starting with you, Evan.
It's hard for me to conceive, at least at this point, of China doing any arm twisting in Moscow, or doing anything other than the rather unsubtle messages that it conveyed at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. This is a very delicate relationship between Moscow and Beijing. It's one that obviously Russia needs, but it's also one that China needs very much as it continues its contentious relationship with the United States, and also, I might add, with India, but I'll let my colleague talk about that. But it's just hard for me to believe right now that the Chinese would be prepared to weigh in any way, shape, or form, because at least at this point, it seems to me that there are more advantages rather than disadvantages accruing to the Chinese by seeing the United States and others burdened by what's going on there, to see them possibly distracted by what's going on. But going back to the point I made earlier about the Taiwan factor, if the Chinese had any grand ambitions regarding, military ambitions regarding Taiwan, I suspect there were some strong arguments now having been made over the last several weeks or so inside Beijing, saying we're not going to be able to realize that game plan. So there's a bit of frustration, I imagine, in Beijing. But once again, not enough for the Chinese to want to weigh in and risk undoing the bromance that they have with the Russians, and risk the geopolitical setback that a break or a fraying of that relationship with Moscow might bring about.
Pramit, any pressure from India that might have any effect?
Pressure from India, I believe, in fact, the private conversation between the two leaders was a lot more stormy at the SCO. But no, ultimately for Russia, India, Russia has more leverage on India, if you wish, right now, both on the military front and to some degree now on the energy front, as India is importing about 1 million tons of oil, discounted oil, every month to defray the inflationary pressures that its economy is facing. India has never been an economic partner to Russia. Before the war, only 1% of Indian trade was with Russia, and most of that was fertilizer and other very basic materials. So for Russia, the only real utility of India, I would argue, is for Russia to be able to make the claim that only the West opposes us, everybody else is either neutral or supportive. And the fact that we are a member of the BRICS and the SCO and organizations in which Russia was a founding member or takes very seriously. But beyond that, India doesn't have much pressure or leverage, should we say, on Putin. Both Prime Minister Modi and Vladimir Putin are both completely unsentimental about the relationship. But for Modi, the game, I think, will really be is to ensure that the Indian economy is not doesn't undergo the same similar collapse, or at least that, let's say, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and to some degree Bangladesh are facing right now because of energy problems. So yes, India can make it clear that it's not happy with what's going on, but it accepts, I think, realistically, that it doesn't have much capacity to do much about it.
So no equilibrium in sight, I guess it's fair to say. Any other questions from the audience, or in the room or virtual? Yes.
Yeah, there was a question before about a steady state in the war on the ground. I have a question about the steady state of sanctions. after this. Russia, in a sense, had since 2014 to prepare for sanctions, and it was probably overwhelmed by what actually was implemented, and not just officially or legally by those that had to, but by countries and companies that wanted to, even though they didn't have to enforce sanctions. So again, the question is, like, what do you believe to be the steady state for sanctions as this conflict perhaps goes into a stalemate or an equilibrium? Do we see more use of sanctions, or do we walk them back? And it's particular to reserves, as you mentioned, the sanctity of reserves.
Okay, maybe we'll start with Adam, your view on that question about where are we going with the sanctions, steady state, escalation of the sanctions, or what circumstances could see a rollback on sanctions against Russia?
Well, the US is a major determinant of the answer, so I should perhaps look to Evans as much as to Europeans. But if I'm right that we are facing a confrontation that's highly attritional, that has all the features of a classic Cold War, where the two sides do as much damage to each other and seek as much advantage for themselves as possible, short of outright military conflict. And if that is, if I'm right that this is quite likely to persist even beyond Vladimir Putin's tenure in office, then I think we are likely to see not only the persistence of Western sanctions, and we've seen repeatedly how once the West establishes sanctions and makes the economic adjustments, it's then politically very difficult to ratchet back. But I would expect, as I argued, that we would see the emergence of selective secondary sanctions in order to the better to prosecute this Cold War. Leading candidate is, although a very difficult target, is to try and target those exporting microchips to Russia that are, we know, absolutely vital to its continued military capabilities. So I don't know whether it's equilibrium or not, but even in conditions of equilibrium, I would expect this Cold War dynamic to persist and ramify, I'm afraid. I'd just like to add very briefly in response to Pramit and Evans that since I'm such a little ray of sunshine at this gathering and have already predicted that the confrontation is going to get uglier and have spoken about a real nuclear crisis in the coming months, I think it's just possible to imagine, but Evans, I am no expert here, I really defer to you, that a very serious nuclear crisis, conceivably even limited weapons use by Russia, could lead Beijing to say enough is enough. That they're not going to rein Putin in, they're not going to stop him from doing what he wants to do to Ukraine, but not let it get nuclear.
Okay, thank you. Evans, yes, please go ahead.
I completely agree with Ambassador Thompson on that point. As we saw with North Korea and China back in 2017, it was the prospect of a peninsular war literally on China's doorstep, undermining stability and security on China's doorstep, and the possibility that that war would spill over into China that got the Chinese on board with the actions that the UN Security Council ultimately took against North Korea. Things have gotten a lot better between Beijing and Pyongyang since then, and will continue to improve, I believe. But I think it is very correct to say that if China begins to fear that Russian actions will have the effect of undermining China's own security, then I think the calculus would indeed change and would shift thinking in Beijing in the direction of using whatever leverage it has to tell Moscow that the time has come to stop this. The Chinese cannot and will not tolerate actions that undermine their own security.
Okay, thank you. I think there were some more questions along here. Did I get that wrong? Or no, if not, maybe I can ask a question about the prospect of this escalation that Louise mentioned. That is, short of even of the use of tactical nuclear weapons, but the use of a dirty bomb. There's been a great deal of discussion about what the response might be to the use of tactical battlefield nuclear weapons, such as the U.S. destroying the Black Sea Fleet or the Baltic Fleet of the Russian Federation. What do you think would be the response to this false flag kind of operation, using a dirty bomb, and so therefore breaking another taboo, but not the one that most of the world has been worrying about for a little while? What do you think the response would be by the U.S. And by China and India and also, of course, Europe as well? Maybe we can start with you, Evans.
Waiting in the wings, if you will, in terms of further steps that the United States and or NATO might take on Ukraine's behalf is the possibility of us changing the ground rules under which we've been operating to provide security assistance, technical assistance, et cetera, to Ukraine in its combat with the Russians. And what I mean by that is, thus far, we have avoided giving the Ukrainians certain systems and capabilities that would lift Ukraine's offensive ability to a whole new level and give them an offensive capability that might be used, for example, against Russia itself. We've also obviously refrained from engaging in air operations using NATO/US assets to help Ukraine. I think that something that would be on the short list of steps that NATO and or the United States might take in the event Russia escalates along these lines those two things might be on that short list. I also think, and I think Ambassador Thomson alluded to this earlier, about the possibility of some sort of covert actions that the United States and others might take inside Russian territory to undermine Russia's warfighting capability. I think that's another thing that might be considered. I would not be surprised to discover years from now, when the memoirs and the records are finally opened up, that through whatever channels that exist, suggestions along those lines have already been made to the leadership of NATO and the United States. And I would also suggest that warnings along those lines may have already been conveyed to the Russians about the price that Russia might have to pay in the event of an escalation of that sort.
Adam, would you have anything to add?
I agree with that, although I also do worry that our Western politics might lead to something more like a shrug of the shoulders, depending on what actually happened, how egregious Russian lying was about this. In other words, how provocative it was. It would be very important, I think, in the thinking of Western capitals, to make sure that the international community was on their side, that their narrative and not the Russian one about what actually happened was dominant. So there might be some space left for doing what Rafael Grossi of the IAEA has been heroically doing over the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, and getting the international community in there, fact-finding, talking to both sides, trying to cool it. But it's the problem with deterrence all the way up the escalation ladder, that it works until it doesn't. And once it doesn't, escalation is quite likely.
Mm. Pramit, would you add anything with there might be a response from India or more pressure in that scenario of a dirty bomb?
Yeah, well, the Indian foreign minister at the UN General Assembly at his last speech actually made it very clear that India would have serious objections to the entry of nuclear weapons into the battle. And yesterday, the Indian defense minister spoke with his Russian counterpart and made the same message, that nuclear weapons should be kept out of this picture. So if that's being said publicly, in the sense that it is being released to the public afterwards, we assume that in private, the message is much stronger. But I think one of the key points that I suspect the Indian system has been pointing out to Russia is that if you go nuclear, the sanctions, not just the energy sanctions, but the military technology sanctions that exist today will become permanent. At this point, it's not just a question of whether you become close to China. You can no longer even supply the weapons. You don't have the you're already struggling to supply weapons to your own army under the present sanctions. This would mean the end of the Indo-Russian relationship in almost every possible context, except maybe fertilizer. But therefore, keep in mind exactly what may result from your actions.
Okay, well, that sounds like the one ray of light in this, that there's a lot of pressure, would be a lot of pressure that might prevent, the use of a dirty bomb or a nuclear weapon. Did you want to say something?
If I can add one possible other ray of light, what we've seen in the past weeks with sort of suggestions that there might be the build up towards a false flag event. Initially, it was thought that would be, a false flag event against a major hydroelectric dam that would have flooded the upper reaches of the Dnipro River, and also could have had serious consequences for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. What we've seen is sort of the saturation of intelligence, including open source intelligence, that makes it much harder for the false flag event to be portrayed convincingly. And I think the moves by Russia in the past week, in terms of trying to frame the story and test the information space. Okay, how much are our counterparts, in the United States and the United Kingdom going to believe, the calls that we're making? Shown just the difficulty of actually conducting that sort of false flag attack. That it would be very difficult for Russia to deny its direct role or to frame it as some sort of Ukrainian sabotage.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
Yes, a question from the audience from Uruguay. One of the highlights of the National Congress was the unification of China goal. And the question is related with that. Is that possible to achieve that without military intervention, especially in the case of Taiwan?
Sorry, without having an invasion.
Without having military intervention.
Right. Reunification without an invasion. Yeah. I guess this is a question best posed to Evans. Sorry, I think you're on mute.
Here we go. If you take the Chinese position, PRC's position literally, their preference, their policy is for the pursuit, the achievement of peaceful unification with Taiwan. That's their policy. But then, of course, the Chinese add to that that in the event that independence is declared or independence is actively pursued by Taiwan, that they reserve the right to use military force to achieve their objective of unification with Taiwan. Setting that aside, my first tour as a diplomat was in Taiwan. I've spent a lot of time working in Beijing and Taipei over the years. The transformation of popular attitudes in Taiwan over the last several decades has been dramatic. The development of a Taiwan identity, the actions that the PRC has taken against Taiwan over the years, particularly recently, what the Taiwan people have observed going on in Hong Kong, as Hong Kong's freedoms and rights have been stripped away very, very quickly, has given lie to the Chinese assertion that one country, two systems is a viable way forward. I can see no prospect whatsoever at this point that the people on Taiwan, the authorities in Taiwan, would be prepared to consider a peaceful unification with the mainland. The preference, and this is supported by public opinion polls in Taiwan, the overwhelming preference of the people in Taiwan is for a continuation of something resembling the status quo right now, which is, as some have described it, de facto independence rather than de jure independence, trying to have a proper relationship with the PRC, but not being absorbed by it, by having a peaceful relationship across the straits, but not one that puts Taiwan on the fast track to unification. That's obviously not the PRC's goal, although there are some in the mainland who continue to argue quietly these days that a continuation of the status quo is eminently preferable to a confrontation across the straits or a violent assault on Taiwan. But the reality is, if you look at it from the Taiwanese perspective, there's no interest whatsoever in what Beijing is selling, whether it's peaceful reunification or obviously unification through force.
Okay, thank you. We only have 1.5 minutes left. If there's a last question, we can take it, or I can ask one. Maybe I'll go ahead. In 30 seconds or less, Marco sort of argued that we have come to the end of Pax Americana, and we're heading towards a multipolar world. I just wondered what each of your take is on that. Maybe we'll start with you, Adam.
Yes and no, because our world is not three-dimensional or even five-dimensional. It's more complicated than that. So there's no question that there are, compared with the 20th century, going to be some significant power centers other than Washington or Beijing. And they will be important for various aspects of policy. At the same time, I'm afraid, if I am right about the Cold War dynamic that I see, it looks awfully familiar. My first posting was Moscow, 1981. There is going to be Pax Americana, but only over half the world. It's going to continue to extend to Europe for a long time to come, despite American-encouraged greater European strategic autonomy, simply because Europe is structurally less efficient militarily. And we're going to see a Pax Americana, I think, to some extent, reasserted in some parts of the world as a result of a weakening Russia. I mean, perhaps more in North Africa, where at the moment the Wagner group is causing trouble, more in sub-Saharan Africa, possibly even a little bit in Central Asia, as Central Asians look to offset rising Chinese influence and diminishing Russian. So with all due respect to Marco, I don't think Pax Americana is done yet. It's just not going to be global.
Right. Evans?
I think Ambassador Thompson has got it just about right. I would suggest that we're looking at the possibility of Pax Americana, not only in Europe and the other areas that the ambassador mentioned, but also to a large extent in East and Northeast Asia, as an effort, as others in the region look to the United States for support and for coordination as we deal with a difficult situation with the Chinese for the long haul. I would only add to that the one wild card in all of this is where our domestic politics go in the United States. Not only in the election next month, where the Republicans may very well take back one and possibly both houses of Congress, but obviously in the next presidential election. If this America First mentality that we saw in the Trump administration is as strong as it was then I believe America's alliance system, America's partnerships, regional and global partnerships, defense and security partnerships, could very well be in serious trouble. I hope I'm dead wrong about that, but this is something that we need to keep a careful eye on.
Okay, yeah, we'll have to hope President Trump gets the memo. Pramit, Pax Americana in South Asia or Pax Indica?
I'll just say that on the multipolarity, when I studied international relations, one of my professors described one of the phases, I think largely after the Vietnam War, when America had sort of also withdrawn a bit, as multi-bipolarity. In other words, you can have two broad poles, and in this case, I think US and China are emerging as those two poles, and countries aligning, if you wish, with those poles, but without necessarily joining those poles. And I think what we're seeing definitely in the Indo-Pacific with the Quad and America's restructuring of the regional security architecture with AUKUS, a Japan, Taiwan, US triangle in the north, and now India and the US are now working on one in the Indian Ocean. The development of a very clear pole with relatively independent players within that, definitely India being one of them. But it's very clear that India and China are never going to have a good relationship. In fact, it is now completely poisonous between the two sides. If America and the Atlantic do come together more strongly than it is now, especially on the military side, if Europe begins to become a genuine military player, then you have another element to that same. The question is, does Europe adopt the same stance towards China that it presently has towards Russia? And if India decides to do the same things towards Russia as it is now looking towards China, then automatically you have really divided, you have about 2/3 of the world right there aligned on one side. So those are the flips that you're going to have to watch out for. But I think multi-bipolarity is a pretty good description of where I think it's going.
Okay, well, I think we have to bring the proceedings to an end there. Very interesting discussion, very troubling, and makes me think that instead of having lunch, we should have a good stiff drink. But anyway, please join me in thanking our great panel for a terrifying discussion. So, thank you. Thank you all.
Okay, well.